blockchain for me provides a Schelling point, a gathering point upon which the hopeful can emerge, and we can imbue a new sense of civic duty and trust, and the incentives can be aligned such that you can support your family and you can have a career while being civically engaged. And I think that that's the sweet spot of the kind of culture that can emerge in and around this space. So, people look at Web3 and crypto and they might just see Lambos and Bored Apes and things like that. But there's a real possibility now that we can program our values into our money, and that there's enough capital in this space that we can engineer more civic values into a new generation. And I'm really curious to see how beautiful and weird it gets.
Welcome to The Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Today's guest is Kevin Owocki, and in this discussion, we go into Gitcoin, the journey behind it, and how it's now a fully operating DAO independent from Kevin. We discuss Allo, the protocol built by Gitcoin, and how it's designed to support communities in funding what matters. I believe these patterns will shape the future of philanthropy and public funding. We also go into Greenpill and Greenpill version 2, which just launched, and Kevin shares some of the exciting plans ahead. Kevin talks about what he thinks crypto gets wrong when trying to onboard more people into Web3 or going mainstream. And finally, I asked Kevin about hypercerts and impact certificates and what he's seen in the landscape. This conversation was recorded at the ReFi Summit in May 2023 in Seattle. Let's dive right in with Kevin Owocki. We are here today with Kevin Owocki. Kevin is the founder of Gitcoin. He's a software engineer and needs no introduction to many in the Web3 space. Thank you, Kevin, for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
And so what brings you to ReFi Summit?
Well, I think that we've got a once-in-a-generation opportunity to build new economic systems that are more regenerative for the planet, regenerative for our communities, and regenerative for our spirit. And so exploring that idea space with some of the top minds in the ecosystem.
Great. Yeah, and you gave a great opening keynote talk this morning. We'll put a link in the show notes for people who want to watch that online. And you just launched Greenpill version 2 today on stage. Congratulations.
Yeah, thanks. It was a lot of fun.
What is Greenpill?
So Greenpill is a community of people who are practicing the theory of regenerative crypto. So basically what we are is, there's a book that I wrote called Greenpilled: How Crypto Can Regenerate the World, exploring the idea set of how we can program our values into our money and build more regenerative economies. And we've also got a directory of different impact DAOs that are meant to create impact using Web3. And we've got local chapters, about 25 local chapters right now all over the world on 6 continents that are practicing this in their local communities. So to choose to be green-pilled is to choose to accept that we can build a more solarpunk regenerative future and to practice making it happen. And Greenpill V1 was just the book. But now there's a whole network, there's a podcast, there's local chapters, and there's people actually practicing it. So that was what I launched on stage at the ReFi Summit today, Greenpill V2.
Awesome. I think for those of us who are familiar with the Web3 space, you don't really need an introduction, but I think those who may not have as much context, like one thing that's just always noticeable is like you produce an enormous amount of work. Like you're very prolific, whether it's Gitcoin, Super Modular, the books, now the podcast, even the Greenpill podcast. You've already produced hundreds of episodes in a very short period of time. a lot of different experiments and things that you've been incubating. I guess just to start out, I'm also really wanting to ask you, like, how do you find the energy and time for all of it? Like, what is it that you're sourcing here that makes you feel like, so in flow to produce so much?
Yeah. Well, it's really kind of you to say that. I think that when you see the work that's coming out of my ventures, you're seeing the work of tens and sometimes hundreds of people. Gitcoin is now a DAO with 60 people that are working on funding what matters. My venture studio, Supermodular, is now 15 people, and we work pretty heavily in public with the public. And so when you're seeing the work that I'm producing, I think that it's representative of a network of individuals that are doing the work. And I think that I'll probably get the credit and the blame for everything that network does for a long time. And so, I mean, credit where it's due. It's movement now, and I think that you're seeing the work of a bunch of networked individuals who really care about this space. And but what I draw on is hope for a better future. I really truly do believe that now that we have this gift, the ability to program our values into our money and to build new economies that are based off of those values, that we can truly do a lot to regenerate ourselves and our local communities, and if we're lucky, the world. But I also want to be clear-eyed about this. The book is entitled How Crypto Could Regenerate the World, and nothing makes me cringe more than when someone pulls me onto a panel about how crypto is saving the world right now. Because I think the space has it's got a lot to go until it's actually delivering on those promises. So the opportunity to realize that potential is, I think, what gets me up in the morning and really excited to work on this, and to ship content and to ship mechanisms that are making it happen takes a lot of energy. But it also forces trade-offs. I think I'm pretty prolific for shipping things early and often. There's this saying in technology entrepreneurship that if you're shipping something when it's perfect, then you shipped it too late. And the Green Pill book shipped with a couple typos here and there, and a couple things out of place, but it's got a following of over 10,000 people now, and it's because I shipped it and I iterate on fixing it later that we're really able to enter this dance with the network in which we're really testing our hypotheses in real time. And so it's a great joy to work on this. But I'd say my 3 secrets, to answer your question concisely, are working within a network, and then just drawing from that source of hope for a better world, but also being clear-eyed about where we're actually at. And then the third thing is just release early and often.
And on that, kind of part of that statement you made about shipping early and often, but like you also emphasize learning out loud, learning in public, this kind of transparent way of doing things. And that seems to be a departure from how Web 2 kind of culture operated to how the Web 3 space and some of these DAOs are operating. I'm wondering if you could share more of what you're noticing in that culture shift.
Yeah. Well, if you've ever been on a landing page or you've been to a conference where it's just buzzword soup, then maybe you'll notice the contrast, just to talk about like all of the synergies between our global network of blah, blah, blah. Like I can't even do a good straw man of what it sounds like because I just tune it out as soon as it hits me. And it's this corporate PR speak that's just totally greenwashed that I think that it has led people craving a new type of authenticity. And when you make mistakes in public and you learn in public, then you're doing it authentically. But it's also a form of alpha, a form of getting ahead, to just be able to, if we have a great conversation right here and you give me some idea, I can just tweet it and my network will tell me this is stupid or this is the greatest thing since Green Pill V2. And it's that learning within a community and that authenticity that I think that people are craving. And it's just because everything has been so sanitized in the way hierarchical large mega corporations do their PR speak that I think has led people to crave a new type of authenticity, and authenticity builds trust. And what we're here to do is to build a global network of impact network. And you can't do that without people trusting each other in the network.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I remember when I started to lurk around more of the Gitcoin community a couple of years ago, and it was just astonishing to me that I could just like click a few buttons, and then I was like, oh, I'm in the Telegram group with the product team, and then I click over here, and it's like, oh, there's the roadmap, and then let me go over here, like,
Yeah.
oh, there's the Twitter Spaces with Kevin talking about it. It's just like it's like this walking into a work environment where there was no there were a lot of gates. You know, it was kind of like permissionless in the sense of the word, but it does engender trust because it's like it's so transparent, and it's like, you know, and it does also make sense that you've been continually reinforcing the why are we here and what are we really trying to accomplish, and kind of producing the media and the memes and the storytelling and so forth, because you have to kind of make sure that that persists to reach above all of the noise. Especially going through what must have been a crazy bull market mania for you guys, you know, with all of the crypto casino stuff and NFTs and everything else. Yeah, any thoughts or comments on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, so Gitcoin was actually bootstrapped as a corporation between 2017 and 2021. On May 25th, 2021, we made it into a DAO. So basically a network that's governed by a governance token called GTC. And the idea was that if you're going to build infrastructure for funding the public and funding the commons, then corporation is not the right model for it. Having a hierarchy is not the right model for it. That network needs to be governed by the community that it serves, and that's what provides the foundation of legitimacy for the network. There's this idea in political theory that the consent of the governed is the only legitimate basis for government or state power. And I really found that to be such a profound idea. And again, Web2 has left us lacking here. The opposite of consent of the governed is this idea of the divine right of kings, in that I've been bestowed to rule from on high. And I think that if you look at the Web2 giants, you sort of have this sort of divine right of kings rulership mentality, where you've got the shareholders on one side and they give you the divine right as CEO to service community over here. And what happens in practice is that the management team is continuously, because they have to return value to shareholders, they have a fiduciary duty, they're always trying to extract from their community and to deliver to their shareholders. And so I really feel like Web2 is ruling by divine right of kings. And in Web2, we're all sort of serfs on Zuckerberg's land or Bezos's land or Google's land. And so what we really wanted to do is wanted to do something different, where we wanted to make the consent of the governed the foundation of Gitcoin governance. And so we released a governance token called GTC and gave it to the people that have been using the platform. And now we have this closed loop where the people who are using the platform are the ones that are governing the platform, which provides a basis for legitimacy. And so that was the whole reason why we launched the DAO and we were working in public. And, you know, you can't work in public without publishing your roadmap and giving access to the founder and all of those type of things. And so it's been an experience in kind of like giving away a lot of control, but also receiving a lot of love and new relationships back. You know, like the fact that we're friends now has kind of resulted out of that. And, you know, it's not all, like, let's be real, it's not all rainbows and sunshine. Like, there are some assholes that showed up in that network, and you have to weed those people out, because if you don't, then they're going to poison the whole well for everyone else. And so the permissionlessness is great for access, and there's town square. It's always important to have town squares where there is permissionless and there's transparency, but you also have to kind of create the curated group that it's curated by the vibes, because no one wants to be in a place where they don't feel safe, or where they can't retreat into a place that feels safe. So there's been a lot of nuances that we've discovered, and the only way that we could have ever discovered it is just by experimenting, by fucking around and finding out. And that's been sort of the great joy of Gitcoin becoming a DAO.
And what did you learn about how to weed out bad actors or weed the garden from, you know, people that may not be the right fit in the community?
I mean, I think that this requires nuance to do, and there's people that talk about the value of permissionlessness and that anyone can show up and have access. And I think that that's really important for a town square, to have permissionless connectedness. And so when the DAO first launched, everything was a town square. And then we sort of realized, oh wait, having a place where there's a vibe check is also important. And so I think it's being able to hold both the curated modality and the permissionless modality in your mind and not go insane is the first step. But once you've done that, then I think it's a matter of showing up to both spaces as your best self in both of those contexts and creating a sort of membrane between them where the curated group, if you pass the vibe check, you can get invited into the curated group, and then encouraging people in the curated group to come and lead by example in the town square. So one of actually the fun things about where Gitcoin has landed is that I'm its founder, one of its co-founders, and I'm actually not in control of it anymore. So the most important set of people at Gitcoin is arguably the ones who are making the decisions about where to take it. And I'm not in that set anymore because we've decentralized it back to the community. And, people always say like, well, why did you do that? And I think that the fun thing is that along with decentralization of power comes decentralization of stress. So I'm like way less stressed than I was when I was in charge of all the decisions at Gitcoin. Vitalik Buterin has this post about how control is liability. And so if I had been in control of Gitcoin and all of its decisions, then everything would have rolled up to me. And I would always be very stressed about that. But now we have a decentralized governance process and a democratic governance process. And that allows other people to feel more heard, and it creates space for other leaders to step up and lead. And so it's fun to talk about how we curate control to different participant sets when I'm not even in some of the most important ones at Gitcoin DAO. And it's also freed up my mind space to do things like work on Green Pill and come to the ReFi Summit. So that's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, I feel like our generation of entrepreneurial kind of storytelling and mimetic desire was more constructed around you build a company and then you go public someday and maybe it lasts forever. Like that was the dream I was sold. And I feel like the dream is actually like exit to community and to see like a group of people that care so deeply about the project that they continue to cultivate it, and that's actually, the highest form of success. And hats off and congratulations that you've managed to do that with Gitcoin. Maybe taking a step back in the Gitcoin journey now, especially now that you can kind of see it with a bit of distance, like can we frame a little bit more of like, what is Gitcoin? What is it doing and the trajectory that it's on?
Yeah, so Gitcoin is infrastructure to fund what matters in your local community. And they've built a thing called Allo Protocol, which is a protocol for allocating funding to what matters in your community. So basically, if you're someone who's a philanthropist that wants to stimulate, let's call it climate, if that's what matters to your community, then you can deploy a funding round on Allo Protocol on Gitcoin's technology. And basically what you can use that matching pool as is you can allow people who are funding grants on Allo Protocol to have their matches, to have their contributions doubled or quintupled, or sometimes we've seen 10x or 100x matching. So it's a great way to fund what matters in your community, but also to get people in your community to bring out their wallets and actually fund $1 or $10 of what matters to them, and people actually will get out their wallets because the matching multiples are so great. And the reason the matching multiples are so great on Gitcoin is that we use this thing called quadratic funding, which sounds scary and mathy, but it's actually not all that complicated. It's just basically funding projects from the matching pool on the basis of the number of people that have funded them, not the amount of capital that flows into them. And so, Matthew, if you had a project that raised $100 from 100 contributors, and I had a project that raised $100 from one contributor, then you would have a much higher matching multiple because you've got way more people that actually think that your project matters. And so Gitcoin is a crowdfunding platform that allows you to fund what matters. And we have this really beautiful mechanism that gets people to actually fund what matters in their own community. And it's a really elegant way of decentralizing control of funding decisions out to a community that you serve, instead of creating this power dynamic where a philanthropist or a grant administrator who doesn't actually live embedded in their community and doesn't want the power dynamics associated with people knowing they have a bunch of money, that for them to actually get their community to fund what matters. And so we've distributed about $50 million worth of funding to various communities in Web3, but we're also starting to get into pro-social causes like climate, diversity, equity, inclusion, decentralized science, and things of that nature. So it's a pretty interesting project and protocol that I'm just really feel like it's a gift to work on. And the last thing that I'll say is that the mechanism that we're using is called quadratic funding. It's invented by Vitalik Buterin, who's the founder of Ethereum, Glenn Weil, who is a research scientist at Microsoft, and the founder of Radical Exchange, and then Zoe Hitzig. So they're kind of the big brains behind this mechanism of quadratic funding, and Gitcoin is the project that's brought it into prominence in the Web3 ecosystem. So it's been a real collaborative journey.
Yeah, and we're putting links in the show notes to the original white paper, as well as some of the other resources around quadratic funding. And, so much of the genesis of Gitcoin, is, per my understanding and having heard you speak to it, is, open source software is notoriously difficult to fund. And so it is a public good. And so starting with the public good of open source software, how do we fund open source developers to get livelihoods and paid for the work and the value that they're creating, is kind of the seed of what now is multiplying and fractaling out into all sorts of different types of public and commons goods resourcing challenges, which of course, climate is one of those. And yeah, I guess I would emphasize as well, like just maybe we walk through an example. So we at Biome Trust, a philanthropic organization, we currently have the responsibility to both select which organizations receive funds in our grant making program, or gift making, as we like to call it. But we also have to decide how much to each organization. And those two functions can actually be split apart a bit more democratically. And we could bring around now on Allo through the rounds manager. And I mean, this is all like currently pretty fresh technology. So it's still early days, a couple of weeks old. But what's very exciting is the idea we can say, okay, well, we're going to put a $100,000 matching pool up to these 10 organizations. And then those 10 organizations can go to their respective communities and networks and say, great, we want to unlock as much of the matching as possible. Will you, contribute $5, $20, $100, whatever. And the formula, the quadratic part of this, is really just a forcing function that it's not just based on one-to-one dollar match. It is something that recognizes that if a project has a lot more people behind it, that's very important, not just the dollars that they're bringing. So it's kind of like a mathematical way to somewhat redistribute governance power around the capital. And the fact that the incentive of the organization is to go get their network to contribute, it creates like kind of a shelling point, a place that magnifies the entire culture of giving to these projects, and it kind of becomes its own network effect. So the Gitcoin Grants rounds have become their own event. So you run them every quarter, and how many have there been now?
Yeah, well, I don't run them every quarter, but DAO runs them every quarter.
Yeah,
but
Gitcoin.
That's the fun thing. Yeah, so I mean, Allo Protocol and quadratic funding is just a really beautiful way to invite your community to fund what matters to them. And you as the grant administrator get to see what the people actually on the ground in these communities embedded in these value spaces actually care about. And you actually get them to co-fund your projects as well. So you're kind of like doubling the reach of your funds by inviting the community to the dance with you. It also relieves you of the burden of deploying the funds yourselves and all of the trappings of it and the power dynamics of people seeking out coffee to pick your brain or whatever power dynamics will emerge whenever you have a bunch of capital to deploy. So yeah, we've But yeah, to actually answer your question, Gitcoin runs these rounds on a quarterly basis. They've done 16 rounds, so about 4 years worth of funding. And what's really very beautiful is that if you have a quadratic funding round once, then it might be an interesting event where you get to measure what matters in your community at that one time. But when you're running around every quarter, January, April, June, September, and then the next January, you start to get a line, not just dots. And what becomes really beautiful is the behavior change you see when you're funding what matters in 1 month, and then your community learns, oh, there's going to be another round in 3 more months. And then you do that round, and then that reinforces the behavior of, hey, what if I start doing stuff that matters in this community? I'm probably going to be able to pay my rent for a couple months in 3 more months because I know that there's going to be a quadratic funding round happening. And it's that stability of the cadence of the rounds that allows people to start relying on it. And it creates a behavior shift in your community where if you're running a climate round, then a rational person working in the climate ecosystem can start to rely on that capital on a regular basis. And it starts to allow them to stimulate more investments in whatever their business is. And the virtuous cycle is that they make more investments in doing better work for the community, and they raise more funds so they can make more investments in doing better work for the community. So it's really a virtuous cycle that we enter into the communities that we serve. And, of course, this relies on the fact that there's continually funding available that's committed over time. But yeah, it's that cadence of the rounds every quarter that I think is part of the beauty of it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I personally am a believer, and I think that the patterning here is going to shift the future of philanthropy and government resource allocation. And that as more and more people wake up to all the problems that this solves, like we're going to just see more and more pools of capital move here. What are some of the big issues, roadblocks, challenges that are ahead?
Yeah, well, you do need to keep feeding capital into the machine. And so raising more money every quarter is a thing. Another challenge that we've been working through is what's called a Sybil attack. And that's basically the idea of sock puppet accounts. So just to work through an example of that, if I'm going to contribute $1 and I'm going to get $100 worth of matching, then I basically have an incentive to make up a bunch of new identities and launder the funds through those identities in order to get higher matching multiples. Because remember, this is a formula that optimizes for what the broad democratic constituency of a community cares about, not just what the rich people are funding. So there's an incentive for an attacker to make up new identities. And so you have to have a good mechanism of measuring the identities of the people in the space. And that's something that we're solving with a tool called Gitcoin Passport. It's just basically a way of connecting your identity across a bunch of different identity tools, Twitter, Facebook, Google, your Ethereum accounts. And it's pretty easy to see the attackers that are coming into the ecosystem and remove their contributions from the matching multiples from there. So Sybil attacks are the largest unsolved problem, but it's something that Gitcoin has mitigated with a tool called Gitcoin Passport, which is a privacy-preserving identity mechanism.
Great. Okay, well, we're going to continue to talk about quadratic funding and these topics on this series and from other voices in the ecosystem as well. But I want to shift a bit more to Greenpill and just hear a bit of what has you so enthusiastic in putting your energy towards that direction now, and what are some of the frontier edges of it?
Yeah. Well, so Gitcoin's now a DAO, and it's been a DAO since 2021, and I've disaffiliated from leadership in 2022. And so I've had a little bit of time on my hands, and idle hands are the devil's plaything is the meme. But I've just been kind of taking that time and channeling it into Greenpill and trying to build a community of people who are using crypto for regenerative means. And when I first wrote the Greenpill book, Gitcoin was sort of one of the lone successes in the Ethereum ecosystem and within the regen category. And it felt kind of lonely. And so I really wanted to do was decentralize my knowledge, my things that I learned by working on Gitcoin to the community. And so I wrote this book called the Greenpill V0 book, How Crypto Can Regenerate the World. And the whole idea was to imbue a bunch of different mental models into a book so that people could easily pick it up and page through it and come up with new ideas for regenerative mechanisms. But it was also about stimulating a movement towards more pro-social, pro-utopian Web3. And, if you watch the news, if you listen to the headlines, Web3 and crypto has a reputation for leaning kind of libertarian, and the ethos of red meat and don't tread on me, that kind of culture. But I fundamentally believe that using these technologies, we can program our values into our money. And so why not leverage these new superpowers to build more protopian, more pro-social, pro-diversity types of tools? And so it's about stimulating a movement towards that. And when I first wrote the Green Pill book, I kind of had that feeling of, is anyone going to come to my birthday party? Is anyone actually going to care about this? But, like I said, I ship early and often, and I had a hunch that maybe there was something there, and I was just blown away by the response. Green Pill has been downloaded over 10. Green Pill has been downloaded over 10,000 times now. There's now a podcast on the Bankless Network, which is one of the more popular Web3 podcasts. That podcast has been downloaded over 100,000 times. And so what I'm doing is that I'm just interviewing other founders that believe in this vision of using crypto to create a more protopian world and creating more pillar content that points to that future and hopefully also illuminates the trends in that, which when you have a network, when one person discovers something and you can broadcast that out to the rest of the network, then what you're doing is you're allowing cross-pollination between that network. So Green Pill is just a vessel for me to practice and interview and learn about regenerative crypto economics. And so yeah, it's been a lot of fun to work on, and I'm really very thrilled to see people actually care about this idea set and are practicing it, and I can't wait to see where it goes.
And part of where it's going, it seems, and with the launch of V2, is this idea of Green Pill local chapters. Can you share more about what that is?
Yeah, so local chapters are Green Pill meetups anywhere in the world. And so we've got chapters in Boston, in Seattle, in Europe. We've got some in Asia. We've got one in Australia. We've got a couple in South America, and even one in Africa at this point. So this is a global phenomenon. And what I'm really excited to do is take people who have local embedded context in each of these geographies and give them the superpower that is quadratic funding, give them the superpower that is community organizing, and allow them to practice it in their local communities. And this is in contrast to what Silicon Valley has done, where it's just exporting the same model out to different parts of the world, Zuckerberging in and giving Facebook community groups to these communities where it's not always a fit for their local context, and even worse than that, extracting from them by pulling ad dollars out of them. And so we're trying to do the opposite with Green Pill, where we're embedding people with local tools and local context and local relationships with the tools that are Web3 and quadratic funding. And so basically global, like a lot of pillar content that allows people to understand these concepts, and then having meetups where you can learn about it by discussing it socially with your community. And I think that the first step will be for these chapters just to happen and for there to be activity in these local jurisdictions. And then the next phase of growth will be that we're going to have these local chapters all create grants on Gitcoin, and then we're going to siphon funds from the main matching pool into these local chapters. And then you're going to have a world where these local chapters are getting a couple $1,000s per quarter in funding for their own public goods. And so, a couple $1,000s in Seattle is different from a couple $1,000s in Africa or in a jurisdiction with a different cost of living. And so what I'm really interested in doing is, once you have these local chapters with trust networks and activity happening in those trust networks, what happens when you start to layer in quadratic funding or UBI or local community currencies into these? This is how we move from how crypto could regenerate the world to how crypto is regenerating the world, assuming we're successful. This is all a giant experiment, and probably a lot of the experiments will fail, but this is why we have 25 different chapters and a dozen different mechanisms for creating regen, is that we can test things out, and we can, as soon as something works in one jurisdiction, we can write a guide about how to do it, a recipe book, and then we can broadcast it to the other places, and then they can try it, they can iterate on it and broadcast it back out to everyone, right? So it's the experimentation and the network that allows a cross-pollination that's going to allow this to happen. So that's the vision. We just launched V2 today. So at Refi Summit in 2024, I'll probably have some learnings about how it's been going. But the vision is to go from how crypto could regenerate the world to how crypto is regenerating the world, and creating a network where people can cross-pollinate those idea sets is the idea.
And I want to connect what we're seeing emerge in the environmental space in a lot of these conversations, where there's been an approach of Paris climate agreement, 1.5 degrees C, 350 parts per million, 400 parts per million, like this kind of top-down, uniform, somewhat global way of thinking about the ecological crisis, into a more local, bioregional type of lens, where it says all places are different. This is really also about community governance and relationships between communities and their place in the natural world. And how do we rethink the ways that we organize as humans on this planet in more of those contexts around things like watersheds? But the challenge around organizing around a watershed is so many of us lack a context to really like go to our local watershed meetup. It's like, many of us aren't necessarily ecologists or experienced at doing the water testing, or, it just lacks a little bit of that on-ramp. And so part of the question I've been holding is like, so what are the ways in which we're going to contextually bring people back into local organizing or local governance and local civics conversations? And I think what the seeds of what you're doing with both Green Pill and Quadratic Funding is when you put a pool of money into a local community and you say, hey, everyone's voice really matters, and we are all tasked with the responsibility of allocating this to where it's needed in our local context, that just radically creates like a very clear context to actually sit down with one's neighbors and talk and to work some of these things out. And I feel like it can be an entry point into some of these other broader conversations, especially if we start, okay, now we have pools of capital for watershed restoration, right? Like, so I don't know if it'll be Green Pill chapters, so to speak, but I think that the contours of that. The other thing I would say is like, crypto is so difficult from a UX perspective for most people. And we still have, far less than 1% of the world really in Web3 crypto usage. It makes sense that in-person, face-to-face, community organizing, networking is going to be part of the formula for bringing more adoption, because people need to kind of, especially when we talk about things like social recovery wallets being key for the onboarding, as well. Thoughts on any of that?
Well, I think that too much of the crypto space starts with how can we get more people adopted to crypto, when really I think the better starting place is how do we help people? Which maybe sounds obvious, but if you're sitting in one of these marketing departments, you might not be brave enough to say it. And we did a Quadratic Funding round for this community of Web3 people that went down to Costa Rica a couple weeks ago. And it was just a small round. It was like 10K, but we were just experimenting with the tech. What would it be like if we did a Quadratic Funding round to fund the people who did surf lessons and did yoga and took us on hikes and stuff like that? And there was 40 participants in the event. 32 of them did Quadratic Funding. We ended up raising 10K in the matching pool and about 7K from the crowd. And one of the ideas that came up during it was, hey, what about the people who work in maintenance at the hotel that we're at? And what about the local woman who came and taught us to make empanadas locally? What about the people who are providing childcare for the event? And one of the things that we did was we made projects for them so that we could quadratically fund them. And we just gave them cash at the end of it. We didn't force them to onboard into crypto. And so I think that what people are getting wrong when they're trying to solve the crypto onboarding problem is that they're starting with a solution and looking for a problem. And really, I think you want to start with a problem and work backwards from a solution. And like, people don't care I flew out here from Colorado, and I don't remember what airline I took. And because the airline for me is a vehicle to get from A to B, the thing that I actually wanted was to be in Seattle, not to be on an airplane. And it's a similar thing with crypto, where it's like the rails that you might be using to regenerate people might be crypto. It might be the banking system. It doesn't matter as long as people are, funding what matters in their local community. And I happen to think that crypto allows for a lot better tools that are open source, and anyone can deploy them. I think that that's a beautiful way for crypto to have a competitive advantage in meeting people's needs. But we shouldn't start with how do we onboard people to crypto. We should start with how do we solve problems, and if crypto is good at that, then we can. So I think that we're probably going to do some quadratic funding rounds that don't even have any crypto rails on them, but it's still a mechanism that was prototyped in the crypto ecosystem and reached maturity in the crypto ecosystem that is going outwards from there. And I think that there's still something beautiful about that, and even if it's not running on the rails that like the Gitcoin protocol running on the EVM or anything like that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the impetus is on the builders to create value and to have that be the natural onboarding function, not to start with how do we onboard. And I do think that there's a lot that will unlock in future second order possibilities once we have greater adoption of these tools. But I don't see a compelling reason to force it, especially since we could just end up scaling the current behavior, which is what I wanted to ask you about next, is kind of so, given that you've been in this space a long time, what is your kind of assessment of where we're at and maybe some of the other challenges or things that we're not quite getting right as a community?
Well, it's hard to speak about the Web3 ecosystem in any meaningful way because the aperture of the question is almost too wide. Within the Web3 ecosystem, these are going to sound like buzzwords to you, but there's layer ones, there's layer twos, there's NFT projects, there's regen Web3, there's bridges, there's side chains, there's DeFi. The Lightning Network and DeFi. And so asking about
it's asking about business.
Yeah, what do you think business is getting right in 2023? And so I think the aperture is too wide. But broadly speaking, I would say that there's too much of a focus on where the cheap bucks can be made, and not a lot of focus on impact. And the ecosystem kind of needs to mature into an immune system where dollars going into meme coins and things that are not actually protopian are going to be disadvantaged versus things that are going into things that actually create impact. So I don't know, I would like to see the ecosystem mature a little bit. And it's kind of like in nature in which you see ecosystems mature, and eventually there's these things called keystone species that develop upon which all the other organisms rely. So humans are an example of a keystone species because so many different animals, dogs, local environments rely on humans. And so I think that we still need to find these keystone species in Web3 that are protopian and regenerative, and they start to create these sort of attractors around which positive sum ecosystems can be built. And that would actually be a dream for me, is if Gitcoin becomes one of those ecosystems. I think there's many other examples, but I think we have to build the attractors to build more positive sum games in crypto, and that's just starting to emerge. There's a glimmer of that right now.
Nice. There's one other thing that I know you've been supporting that I wanted to ask you about, which was hypercerts.
Yeah.
Can you share what are hypercerts? What's going on with that project, and why are you interested?
Yeah, hypercerts are a way of representing impact on a blockchain. So basically, I think that your audience is probably familiar with the idea of carbon credits. So basically, a person takes a certain amount of carbon out of the atmosphere or prevents a certain amount of carbon from being emitted into the atmosphere, and there's a certificate that is issued from that. And then that certificate can have a market value in a world in which there's dollars that are going into carbon offsets. So basically, in whole, what the system does is that it provides a business model for anyone who's not emitting carbon or is preventing carbon from being emitted into the world, because there's a financial market that will purchase that carbon certificate. Hypercerts are like that. except on any impact vector. So you can mint a hypercert for I took tons of carbon out of the atmosphere, or I helped a little lady cross the street, or I funded open source software, or I volunteered in my local community. And so you can create a hypercert really on any type of impact. And what's really beautiful about them is that they are on chain. And so that makes them really easy to trade once you have buy pressure for them. And so I can imagine a world in which an impact DAO or an NGO can just mint hypercerts when it creates impact, and then it can sell those hypercerts. Why is that important? Well, a lot of these organizations are 50% admin overhead and fundraising. And so what if you could just create impact and be rewarded for that impact? Not only can you get rid of all of the infrastructure around writing grant applications and all of that admin overhead, but you can be rewarded by the market for the most legitimate and highest volume of impact that you create. And so I think it's a really important primitive to allow impact to be financialized. And once you've financialized impact, you can pay your bills, and you can spend less time grant writing and more time creating impact. And I think that that's the kind of world that something like hypercerts could unlock. And I'm paving over some details here. How do you evaluate that the impact is legitimate, is an ongoing research problem? How do you engineer buy pressure for hypercerts? That's sort of an ongoing research problem right now, sales and marketing problem. But I do think that the primitive and the way it can shift the incentives of impact projects, impact DAOs, and NGOs is really powerful.
Yeah. Well, again, I think from an ecological lens, there's so many parallels with what's emerging in carbon credits and the evolution of carbon markets, where there's a real desire to beef up the MRV, measuring, reporting, verification standards. There's a desire to see us move beyond carbon into other things like biodiversity markers or water quality. And so, how do we abstract some of the patterns of things like carbon credits into other forms of impact measurements and verify that? And then how do we get the actual, demand, liquidity, and financial, resources? But there are certainly, in speaking to funders from both philanthropic and government side, pools of capital that would love to come into more highly verified outcomes-driven approaches. If we said, I know that my dollar is going to generate X, then I'm willing to, really commit to that or to do it retroactively. So if we can build these kind of, software coordination tools to help facilitate that, it could increase the velocity of capital. And what you're saying is, it's not just carbon credits, it can be any form of impact. We did a deeper conversation around all of this with Holke, who's one of the leads on the Hypercerts Foundation, if people want to learn more.
Yeah. I mean, climate change is a huge problem, and I think it's great to have carbon credits that are working on that, but they're not the only problem. We've got biodiversity collapse, we've got AI alignment, and funding open source software in our digital infrastructure. And the one thing I'll say is that the Oracle problem that you just talked about, how do you measure and value these carbon credits, is a real problem. And I started off with Gitcoin meaning to fund open source software, and I just fell ass backwards into an audience that doesn't have that Oracle problem. You see a GitHub repository with open source software that it's pretty easy to verify that this person was contributing to it, and this is how much value it created. And so, I think I'm very lucky and also privileged to be working in the Ethereum ecosystem where my target audience understands crypto wallets and understands open source software. And so you don't have that Oracle problem. And the real question now, if we want to scale these mechanisms outwards, and I think we should look at it clear-eyed about the challenges with that, is solving the Oracle problem and solving the problem that no one really gives a shit about onboarding into crypto wallets in these spaces. And I think if we can solve those two challenges, then that's a good foothold to start to crypto to start actually regenerating the world. But we're not there yet.
Any other final thoughts or reflections or questions I didn't ask?
I think there's an opportunity here to re-engineer what civic engagement looks like for a new generation. I think that my old man, who's a baby boomer, they had JFK and they had this history of civic engagement that that has really been rich in America and a lot of other places for a long times. And the quote that's ringing in my ears right now is, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." And that's just not the vibe right now in contemporary America and a lot of places in the world. And rightfully so. The world is hard, and in a lot of ways, people don't feel like they have the stability in order to have a lot of civic engagement. But I think there's an interesting question here about what does civic engagement look like for Generation Z and for millennials and for the Generation Alpha that comes after that. And I think that blockchain for me provides a Schelling point, a gathering point upon which the hopeful can emerge, and we can imbue a new sense of civic duty and trust, and the incentives can be aligned such that you can support your family and you can have a career while being civically engaged. And I think that that's the sweet spot of the kind of culture that can emerge in and around this space. So, people look at Web3 and crypto and they might just see Lambos and Bored Apes and things like that. But there's a real possibility now that we can program our values into our money, and that there's enough capital in this space that we can engineer more civic values into a new generation. And I'm really curious to see how beautiful and weird it gets.
Well, I know you've got a panel to get on here at the Refi Summit. Thanks for sitting down and spending the time. Kevin Owocki.
Yeah, this was fun. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers. All right, what do you think of that conversation? Please leave us a comment below. I so appreciate Kevin for his legendary work in the space. He's done so much for the community and is still going strong. For more on Gitcoin, go to gitcoin.co. To learn more about Supermodular, Kevin's venture studio, go to supermodular.xyz. For more on Greenpill and to listen to many great conversations, check out greenpill.network. And to learn more about Hypercerts, go to hypercerts.org. We have links in the show notes. You might also be interested in the conversations we did with Griff Green from Giveth, Deepa Chowdhury from Impact DAO Media, and Holke Brahmer from Hypercerts Foundation. You can find all of those and more at maearth.com. Please like, share, subscribe, join our community Discord. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.